Hey, well, welcome everybody to our first lecture. I'm Professor Michael Beck. And in this lecture, I'm going to be describing some of the 6 major shifts that we have to contend with and some of the major sociologists and conversation partners as we kind of reflect on and explore what ministry is like on this new missional frontier. So I'm going to jump right in here. And I'm going to begin with the passage of Scripture. Judges 2:10 in the Old Testament. There we see, moreover, that whole generation was gathered to their ancestors, and another generation grew up after them who did not know the Lord or the work he had done for Israel. Now, it's fascinating to me that within one generation, a generation of people that crossed over through a split sea and across the desert of sin and enjoyed manna from the sky and quail from the heavens and water from rocks and crossed over into their promised land, who learned to kind of write the scriptures on their hearts and their minds. Within one generation of that, those people, another generation grew up who did not know the Lord or the work he had done for Israel. How does that happen from one generation to the next? Well, I want to posit today that we are experiencing that very same situation here in North America, in the Western church in general. So I want to start with these, just a Cliff Notes version of these 6 major shifts. You can read more about these in the readings, but these shifts are not. I'm not covering all the shifts, right? It's not it's not holistic here, but these are just 6 little sketches of some shifts that we have to contend with on this new missional frontier. And the first one's about our economy, moving from dead presidents to Bitcoin. Another shift has happened significantly in the family, which I describe as from, Leave It to Beaver to Brady Bunch to Modern Family. There's been a shift in religion from Christendom to pluralism and a pantheon of gods, really, and a spiritual but not religious. Technologically, there's a major shift to contend with. We've moved from Morse code to virtual reality, and technology is evolving all the time. Our neighborhood, the structure of society itself has changed from a Mr. Rogers neighborhood to a Neo's matrix. And the church itself is experiencing an identity crisis, where we've moved from Constantinian forms of church to the North American, what I call the empire cult. And then now we're kind of back into this cave situation like those first Christians. So let me walk through this a little bit, and then I'll describe some of our conversation partners here. So to start, moving from dead presidents to Bitcoin, we're seeing the first decentralized currency, a currency that relies on mathematics rather than institutions. And so Bitcoin was kind of the first attempt at that. We've seen other iterations of that come out. Bitcoin, unfortunately, was used immediately in the illegal drug trade. But what we're seeing here is technology and mathematics being used to kind of redefine and reorganize the financial system itself. Now, how do we respond to that as Christians and as the church, and the way that we collect tithes and offerings or offer people a way to give into the life of the church? That's something we're going to think about. The familial unit has changed. So in the 1950s, there was the Leave It to Beaver, which was kind of descriptive of, the kind of the nuclear family there, mom and dad and 2 kids. And if we follow the kind of progress of sitcoms, we see this kind of change in this shift. In the Brady Bunch in the 70s, being kind of prophetic, we saw this first look at the blended family, where different children from divorce, and there's an extremely high divorce rate in the West, where now they're blended together, and the blended family unit becoming one of the largest family units today, one of the most dominant family units today. Now we have modern family, right? So there's this mix of multiple races and multiple sexual orientations, and all of that existing in one big kind of modern family. And another thing to contend with is people just not having families, people not getting married much later, if at all. No desire really to have kids until maybe later in life. So all of these things are shifting, and the church is still kind of programming for that leave it to beaver generation, if you will, really not taking in how do we respond to blended families and every other weekend parenting situations, and how do we respond to this kind of blended mixture of family. The other thing we have to reckon with is just the nature of religion. I call the new Protestant pushing against institutional religion, this kind of new Protestant, if you will, the spiritual but not religious, the spiritual but not religious. And so there's pluralism. There's people that are open to religion, actually open to many different kinds of spiritual pathways. But there's this decline in affiliation with organized religion and organized church, the American church in specific. But then there's this rise in spirituality. So spiritual but not religious is kind of this new mindset of our time. And there's a beautiful thing about that. There's openness and missional opportunity there. So decline in affiliation, rise in spirituality, and kind of a pluralistic society, if you will, and a glocalized society, which means we're global, we're an interconnected network society, as we're going to explore here a little bit. But then we're also localized. And in our local context, there are global factors affecting our local context. And so we've got both macro level things happening in micro communities, and then we've got micro level like artesian and move back to like custom and all of these things in a global network society. The other thing that's really changed the mission field is technology itself. And so in Fresh Expressions in the Digital Age, I kind of studied the history of distance contact. So that first telegraph, electricity was sent across the wire to communicate information very quickly. And that information then created a distance contact situation. So you could communicate across space and time at the speed of light, essentially. And that's kind of transformed really the way we communicate, the way we fall in love. I'm going to dig into that a little bit more here. The structure of society itself has changed. And so from a network society to from a neighborhood, Mr. Rogers kind of neighborhood world, to now a network society. And so interestingly enough, some of us grew up with Mr. Rogers' neighborhood and this kind of this vision of this neighborly good. And this man, if anybody was a pioneer, it was Mr. Rogers, right? Who subversively taught Christian values on public broadcasting network for decades. But that vision of a neighborhood and caring for each other and neighboring, that sociologists have talked about the loss of that. There's a book by Robert Putnam called Bowling Alone that talks about the loss of neighborly good and doing things in community and doing things belonging to different organizations as members and such. Now we live in a network society. So if any of you have seen Neo's, the Matrix films, they're kind of prophetic, right? Because it really envisioned living in these two worlds, like this digital world that's created by our boxes and our wires and our satellites and our technologies, and the physical world. And in a network society, today, many people spend more time in that digital space. Like some people spend 8 to 9 hours a day on their screens, right? Or working through their screens and doing all these things. And then we're in the physical world, and then we're in the digital world, and we're kind of living in these both. So the structure of society itself has changed because of technology and these other factors. We're now in a network society. And the church is in the middle of all this kind of in an identity crisis. So the church started more like a network church, right? We were subversively scratching fish on the wall, kind of hanging out in caves. Christians didn't have buildings. They didn't have professional paid clergy persons. Emperor Constantine comes along in the 300s AD, makes Christianity the state religion. Then things start to shift, right? So now we're building buildings. Now we've got professional clerics. Now we go from hiding out in caves, scratching fish on the wall, to grand building projects and military power kind of backing up the church. And so that's a huge shift. Now, the church that we know, many of us, the attractional only, inherited, Constantinian variety of the church, is most the church that we've known in the West. And now that mode of church is not really connecting with the vast majority of people. We find ourselves kind of back in the caves again, if you will. So we're in this post-everything moment. There's a paradigm shift. David Bosch notes in one of the texts that we'll draw from quite a bit, Transforming Mission, that theoretical frameworks don't replace each other overnight. There's this process that takes place, sometimes decades or centuries, and there's a new paradigm that's emerging. But for the most part, we're still thinking and living and moving in that old paradigm. And as COVID-19 kind of showed us, the first kind of global black swan, if you will, one virus changed the face and the future of the world and accelerated the church into this new space of innovation, right? And did what 2,000 years of Reformation and all teachings and books about this stuff, one global lockdown forced the church to like embrace the internet and embrace technology in new ways, to see that as church as well. And so there's this liminality, there's this in-betweenness. This comes from the work of Victor Turner, where he talks about the pre-ritual state, the post-ritual state, and then there's something in between. So we know the world we're living in, it's post this, right? When you describe everything by post-Christendom, post-industrial, post-enlightenment, all of those words that we use, post means we know what used to be, we know we're not that anymore. We know we're in this in-between thing and we're starting to understand what's emerging, but we're kind of in that liminality. We're in the in-betweenness of it all. And so what we really find ourselves in here is a change of ecosystems. The church as we know it was kind of planted in a jungle, and all this set of social factors came together to create the church as we know it. Gil Rendell, a Methodist scholar, talks about the aberrant time and aberration, the church that came together in the jungle, that was an aberration, that was an unusual set of circumstances. So now we find ourselves living in this desert. And what's before us here is not about technical problems, technical solutions. We'll do church better, we'll have better coffee, we'll do better preaching or better pastoral care or whatever, and our church will come back to life. We're in an adaptive challenge. So the church planted in a jungle now has to learn to live in a desert. The desert is an ecosystem, but it's a very different kind of ecosystem. And now we have to learn, how do we get water from, cactuses or whatever? And some of us are going to get thorns in our hands as we do that and explore this new world, which is what pioneering ministry is all about. So have we been perfectly prepared for a world that no longer exists? Most of our thinking and training and all of that has been geared to one world, and that world no longer exists. So one way to think about this is the difference between kind learning environments and wicked learning environments. So in a kind learning environment, something like chess or golf, there's feedback, there's things repeat consistently, there's like rapid feedback we can learn, there's rules to the game and how everything operates, there's clear boundaries to everything, right? So deliberative practice, instinctive patterns, recognition, that's what we need for mastery in a kind learning environment. But we find ourselves today in a wicked learning environment, like we're playing a game of alien tennis, where we don't even really know who we're playing against. We don't know what the rules are of the game, and there may not be repetitive patterns. Rules are unclear, the status quo is changing, feedback is delayed. We do something and then we don't know if it was the right thing or not for a while. And so the range of skills that we need here is applying knowledge from one pursuit creatively to another. So we learn something in one field and we then apply it to another, or we experiment, iterate. Innovation is very important in that environment. So let's quickly kind of assess our new context. The first task of a leader is to paint an accurate picture of reality. Somebody's got to put a pin in the map among a group of people and say, hey, I think we're kind of here, and maybe this is where God's calling us. Maybe this is where we've come from, right? So what is kind of a snapshot of this reality? Well, I want you to just look over this crowd here from 2005, and I want you to see and just look out on that crowd and see how many phones can you count in the middle of that crowd. Now, this is the Pope getting ready to come out back in 2005. People are all excited, getting ready. Can you count how many phones you see there? So you see a couple there. There's a guy with a flip phone getting ready to see the Pope. Now, no hating on those who still have flip phones. Those were a thing, right? Now I want you to kind of count how many phones do you see just 8 years later, same scene, waiting for the Pope to come out. How many phones can you count now? How many screens do you see there? It's a lot, right? And it's a short period of time, and technology has really changed and not only changed the world and how we fall in love and communicate, it's changed us at an internal level. I want to explain that a little bit, but now we have these supercomputers in our pockets that had some of the same kind of technological power that some of the first satellites had that were sent up into space. So quickly, just generations involved in church. We kind of all know this is not brain science, but about 65% of our congregations are made up of those builders. So that's that great generation that really was invested in the inherited attractional church. Then kind of every other generation, you see it kind of drop off in half, right? Does this look like anybody's congregation if you serve a traditional congregation? And then we get to emerging generations, they're almost non-existent, not even present in the church. Lovett Weems has talked about the death tsunami that's coming for the church. He's speaking specifically to Methodists, but when our builders, when that great generation graduates, and they're already starting to, right, to go and be with the Lord Jesus and rest in his love and his power, then we're on the edge of a death tsunami that's coming for the church. When those faithful ones who've been sustaining the church by their prayers, presence, gifts, service, witness, when they go to be with the Lord, we've got quite a situation on our hands. And overall, the Christian percentage of the population will fall from 73 to 54 to 59 by 2050, according to the Pine Tops research. There's about 80% of churches are declined or plateaued. About 16 of them grow by addition. So that's usually churches that are Christians playing church musical chairs, right? So they'll get another Christian from another church. Like, I'm going to that church because they got better preaching, better coffee, better facilities, whatever. 4% of churches are growing by replicating. So maybe they'll go plant a site and it's mostly already Christians in another area, like a multi-site kind of thing. But less than 1% of our churches are actually growing by multiplication and by reaching new Christians, people that don't go to church. Most of any growth today is around Christians shuffling around to different churches. The nuns are 23% of the population and growing. Those nuns are, no religious affiliation, NONE. They fill out on the survey, I'm a nun. The other large growing group is the duns, and those are people who report having a negative or harmful experience with the church, the duns. And that number of nuns will rise to 48% for Americans under 30. That's a lot. That's 1/3 of millennials not affiliated with any faith. And the pandemic has kind of made it even more challenging. We've seen about 30%, 36% of attendance levels from previous churches. So what we'll explore in Fresh Expressions is, what does connection look like in this new space? What does discipleship look like? What does a both and kind of church look like? And even before the pandemic, only 10% of Christian 20-somethings would have defined themselves with having a resilient faith. And nearly 2/3 of 18 to 29-year-olds who grew up in a church have withdrawn after they become an adult, those duns I was talking about. The Gallup poll that came out just this year showed us that for the first time, that American affiliation with houses of worship dropped between 50%. So for the first time, we have at least less than the population is Christian than is. And in 2020, it was 47. So that's the first time that's happened in American history, by the way. And that's continuing to kind of decline, and all the numbers look that way. Now, none of this is the right motivation for mission and fresh expressions and pioneer ministry that we're going to learn about. We're going to explore an ecclesiology of gift, that the Eucharistic nature of the body of Christ is to be broken and blessed and given away to a hungry world, right? The church is not in the self-preservation business. We're in the self-donation, like breaking pieces of ourselves off, giving away. And beloved people of sacred worth and great value may never know they are loved by God in our current modes of being church. And so we're going to explore some different ways to do that. Now, I want to give you an explosively hopeful way to look at this, that we are in the midst of tremendous opportunity, the greatest missional opportunity in the history of the Western churches right now. And the 60-40 problem, Alan Hirsch talks about this, missiologist, that there's 60% of the population that's not going to be reached by just our inherited attractional only traditional ways of church. In the corporate world, the 60-40 problems about corporations fight in the blood red waters of the 40% of an existing customer base, trying to attract more customers, and they neglect the big blue ocean of the people that will only be reached by innovation. And the church has this problem, doesn't it? We fight in the blood red waters for the already existing dwindling Christian people. And there's this big blue ocean of people that are never going to be reached in that way. So one of the key terms that's important for you to know in this course is the digital age. And this is simply the time period that started in the 70s in which the personal computer became widely available. Then in the 80s and 90s, that combined with internet access, right, and the proliferation of digital devices. 2010s, we saw the smartphone revolution. Now we have a supercomputer in our pocket, right? Billions of people have that. That's created a new social web, hyper-connected mobile technology. And this age has been defined as the information age, the digital age, where these technologies have really kind of reshaped the world. Now, when we think about the magnitude of this kind of global cyberspace that we're dealing here with, in 1996, there were 16 million people using the internet, 0.4% of the global population. 4.57 billion people were internet users by July of 2020. So 60%-ish of the global population. This continues to accelerate. You can see these kind of numbers here, but Facebook now has 2.4 billion active users, which makes it kind of the largest group of people. Like you could think of it as its own kind of nation, really, of active users. And then you see the other numbers there. And 68% of Americans use Facebook as their primary social media channel. In 2018, global e-commerce online stores totaled $653 billion in sales. So you think of Amazon and all these different sales. 96% of Americans shop online. And the average American adult spends 5.4 hours a day on their smartphone, and that's increasing. Millennials spend about 5.7 on their phones. So you see these numbers, the digitization of everything. And if we think about that digital space, it's populated by the largest human population in the history of civilization. It's the biggest mission field where more people are in the same place than ever before, right? And I want you to think about it like that. So when we think about a built environment like a city, so a city is a communication system, and our streets and our buildings and our roads and our walkways facilitate direct contact through physical contiguity, right? So when we are in a city and we move into space, we encounter people. Now in the digital world that's created by our boxes and our wires and our high-speed internet connections, right, and our devices, we now have a new built environment. The web is kind of a global communication system that allows us to have distance contact. So you can think of the web as this one massive global city where we can encounter netizens, citizens from anywhere in the world. And how do we kind of leverage that relational access to people across the globe without losing a sense of placefulness, which I want to talk about, the physical location, the access point where we kind of get in, join into that digital realm. Dr. Sprenger has talked about the information age, and how you're either a digital native or you're a digital immigrant. And if you grew up as a digital native, somebody who grew up with a screen in their hand, right, then you're going to have a different experience of technology of someone who's a digital immigrant who maybe got introduced to these technologies later in life. So know that digital natives and digital immigrants are experiencing digitality and the World Wide Web in different ways. And those, so she says those born before 65, 76, Generation X, they're high levels of education, they're digital immigrants. Those born from 77, 98, Generation Y, the net gen, or the digital natives, they grew up using computers, having computers in the home, and even having access to smartphones and such. Those born after 1999, those people were born digital natives, okay, born at birth, kind of with a screen in their hand. And she says that this digitality and digital natives actually acquire information differently. So there's an icon versus text distinction there. What that means is in the Gutenberg galaxy, in the Gutenberg age, we think in lines of text, right? So the Gutenberg printing press changed the way human beings think. You read your lines of text from left to right in the English language. And if you look at our sanctuaries, they're set up like a page, right? So you got like the lectern, the pulpit up on the front, lines of pews going back, right? But in the digital age, we actually now think iconographically. So we interpret icons. So icons have meanings, and that actually changes the way the brain kind of processes information. So our technologies are not neutral, as Marshall McLuhan said, one of the kind of the digital prophets, this Canadian scholar. The medium is the message, he says. And that's to say, personal and social consequences of any medium, the extension of ourselves, kind of are changed and shaped, and even our brain is kind of rewired by technologies. The technologies that we use shape us and how we interact and how we think. This is important to know. He's been called the founder of the academic discipline of media ecology, probably somebody you can study up on. And he kind of gave us all these ideas about how technology changes things. The message it carries, the medium is not just the message it carries, right? But it also is something to be thought about and explored in its own right. And when we use a technology widely in society, it changes the content and characteristics of that society. And the effects of a technology go deep. The medium shapes our very patterns of sensation and perception. In some ways, digital culture brings us back to a tradition, the oral tradition. The oral tradition was about story and imagery and iconographic thinking. And then when we kind of went to, lines of text and book culture and all of that, there's that linear, line by line spatial organization of the printed page. But in a digital space, we're back to kind of this idea of oral tradition, story, communicating in that way. And the oral and digital technologies, they foster kind of a co-creative, participatory, and ever-emergent experiences in which our deeply embedded memories and new experiences are brought together to create a kind of a cultural coherence. And so we see kind of digital technology brings us back to that. Now, two key people I want to just kind of share with you here before I close this up. Manuel Castells is a pioneering sociologist. He was the first to kind of use this language of the network society. And this is a society whose social structure is made up of networks powered by microelectronic-based information and communication technologies. So as you're reading the Mission Shaped Church report, you're going to see that language of network society borrowing from Castells. And he was the one to kind of describe this emerging societal structure. So in the digital age, we have to recognize the difference between those two kinds of space. There's the space of place, like the physical location where you are, in the space of flows. So Castells was the first to say this technology creates kind of a new kind of space. So there's the space of direct contact, but then there's this other space that we can connect in the space of flows. So through the amalgamation of these technologies, simultaneity was introduced in social relationships at a distance. So distance contact. I can pull out my phone and across the world, I can communicate with somebody on FaceTime, Zoom, whatever. And so we don't have to interact face-to-face in a physical place to have contact. So that's massively changes community and society and the way we communicate. And that changing of that spatiality of social interaction that creates this space of flows, which he defined as the material support of simultaneous social practices communicated at a distance. So if you think of the space of flows as kind of where we are right now in this digital space, it's not fake, it's not less real. We're actually connecting in this kind of this new space, if you will. And so as we'll see in the examination of this space and flows, flows are the means through which people and objects and information are moved through social space. And there's these multiple layers of networks, digital and physical, and they intertwine. So a network's made up of nodes and hubs. And for us in the physical space, we're going to look at another sociologist, Ray Oldenburg, to think about first and second and third places. But these are kind of the fields, like John Wesley went out and started preaching in the fields, right, of the information age, where we go out and form community and share the love of God with people. So we now in this digital age, we have to recognize those two kinds of space, right? We have to deal with that. And we also have to deal with the idea that real virtuality, Castells kind of coined this phrase, that for those digital natives who are born with a screen in their hand, this idea of virtual being somehow less real than physical, that's a false dichotomy. For emerging generations, virtual is real virtuality. Now we have 3 virtual headsets. People are already going to church, by the way, in their VR headsets, right? And so we can't think of the digital as any less real on this new missional frontier. Now, the bad side effect of this is what Castells noted as deterritorialization. Think of it, you can break that word up into 3. So the territory, or the physical dimension where people, culture, connect and place, that's kind of been minimized. And so people don't normally grow up in the same neighborhood, live in the same neighborhood, go to school and work in the same place, right? So there's this fluidity, this mobility to culture, and there's the loss of a sense of a commitment to a place. And that's called deterritorialization, right? Which is a negative thing, because we also need to know our place and to love our place, our physical place and our digital place. So another sociologist that you should study up on is Ray Oldenburg. And he first started to talk about kind of the social dimensions of space. And he used the language of first and second and third places. This is a language we use a lot in the Fresh Expressions movement. The first place being kind of your home space, the second place being your school or your workspace. The third place is kind of that neutral territory where people gather around, that host regular, voluntary, informal gatherings of people. So you can think about all the third places in your communities: bars, restaurants, parks, dog parks, skating rinks, movie theaters. And we're going to see those places as places where church can form. And there needs to be a commitment to our place. So in a network society, we can't just abandon placefulness. Jenny Odell uses this term in her book, How to Do Nothing, to say that places are not just physical space holders. They're living, breathing ecosystems. There's a web of relationships. Every place is made up of particular people and flowers and birds, and every place has a terroir. Like a wine has a taste, the terroir, it has a somewhere-ness. the certain factors come together to make a place what it is. And we need to love our place, and we'll see how Jesus kind of taught us to do that. Here's the good news, and I'll close with this. On the backdrop of a desert of decline, the Spirit has been up to something. And in this new ecosystem where we find ourselves, we're seeing these little seedlings, these new forms of church, fresh expressions of church. There's a groundswell of a movement of God. And we get to be on the front end of this, really just seeing these little fragile and beautiful seedlings coming to the surface. And our friends from the United Kingdom, where this movement started, and I'll share more about this in my next lecture, they are from our future, right? So when we look across the pond to our friends in England and the United Kingdom, what we see is empty churches, significant historic churches that are largely empty. And so that is coming for us, those of us that are in the United States context, the North American context, that is coming for us. The decline and secularization and all of those things, that England is 20 years ahead of us in that. But now this movement called Fresh Expressions also is from our future, and that's come to the shores of North America. And a fresh expression is a form of church for our changing culture. To say it simply, it's for church for people that don't go to church. We're trying to get out in that big blue ocean. We're trying to form church with people in the places where they do life, those first, second, and third places. We're trying to create a network church for a network society. We're trying to get in that, not fight over in the blood red waters for existing Christians, but to reach people that aren't Christians. In each fresh expression, that it has these kind of 4 values that make it what it is. They're missional. They're part of a missional God who sends us into the world. They're contextual, meaning they take on the context. They communicate in a contextual way. They're appropriate for their context. They're not something we try to come plant like a colonial strategy where we try to make everybody look like us or every church look the same. They're formational, so followers of Jesus are being formed and growing as disciples in these, and then cultivating their own new Christian communities themselves. And they're ecclesial, they're fully church. They're not almost church for the people in the tattoo parlor or the burrito joint or the wherever these are happening. They're church, right? And they're connected to the wider church. And one of the beautiful things about fresh expressions, you have to hold fresh expressions and church renewal together, because we're not abandoning the traditional church. We're saying we need that both and way. And these fresh expressions are tethered to and connected with the larger one holy Catholic and Apostolic Church. So it's church in your neighborhood, in your place, and it's a church for a network society. How do we form Christian communities in digital space, and how do we use digital technologies to connect people in physical space? And how do we have a missional way of being church for the neighborhood and a missional way of being church for a network? We utilize those flows and the space of flows and this mobile networked kind of culture to our advantage, like Christians always have. Christians have always adopted the emerging technologies of the day, whether it's the early church with the publicus cursus and the Roman road system and the mail courier system. And then when Christians adopted the codex, like to communicate the scriptures. And so all throughout history, we can kind of look and see how Christians have utilized technology to share the gospel in the world. And we're doing that today with these flows. And they usually form in these first, second, and third places. So networks of churches springing up in the home, networks of churches springing up in workspaces where people go to work, networks of fresh expression springing up all over the place in Moe's Southwest Grill and in the tattoo parlor and the dog park, and pretty much anywhere people can gather around some kind of practice and connect in community, then these fresh expressions can emerge. And we'll examine all of that later. And they typically form around practices. People may or may not know their next door neighbor, but they use technology and meetup and social media to gather around practices that kind of bind people together, whether that's yoga, whether that's walking together in the park, whether that's getting tattoos, whether that's eating together, whatever that practice is, fresh expressions can kind of emerge out of those practices that people are already doing. And here's the last bit of good news. These fresh expressions that have sprung up in the UK, where this movement started, they're finding a way to reach those nuns and those nuns, that these are communities primarily consisting of people that either are done with the church or they're nuns. They have no religious affiliation or no connection, but they're finding a church here in these fresh expressions of church. So this first lecture, we kind of examined all those shifts. I know I threw a lot at you. Please keep up with your readings and follow through with all that. Post in your forums. Let me know if you have any questions. And it was great to be with you. I hope you enjoyed the lecture.